I had my blouse flat on the dry cleaner's counter, a yellow tape measure stretched from shoulder to hem, and three strangers pretending not to watch a grown woman demand justice for half an inch of ivory fabric. The man behind the counter said, 23 inches. I said, out loud, please. Dan whispered, he did say it out loud. I said, not with record-keeping energy. That is the moment everyone decided I was a lot, which is interesting, because I think returning a blouse shorter than it left and then acting like fabric has no memory is also a lot. Let me back up. This was my ivory blouse, not white. Ivory, if you think those are the same, I already do not want you near a dryer setting. It was one of my good blouses, the kind you wear when you want to look relaxed, but still capable of correcting a centerpiece. Dan calls it the button shirt, which tells you everything about why Dan is not in charge of language. I dropped it off on Tuesday with 2 sweaters and a pair of slacks. The man at the counter tagged everything, handed me a receipt, and said, Friday after 4.
Clear, direct, respectable.
On Friday, Dan and I stopped by after lunch. He said we were already in the area, which is how errands multiply. Nobody ever says already in the area before something peaceful happens. Inside, the dry cleaner had the usual atmosphere. Plastic sleeves, warm air, that faint chemical smell that makes every garment seem like it knows something. There were a few people waiting, someone with coats, someone with a suit bag, someone near the back sorting hangers. Normal, I gave my name. The employee pulled my items from the rack. The sweaters looked fine. The slacks looked fine. Then she laid the blouse on the counter, and I knew, not ruined, not shredded, not dramatic enough for people to agree immediately, which is the worst kind of problem. It was subtly wrong. The hem sat higher. The sleeves looked tense. The whole blouse had come back with a new little attitude, like it had gone on a retreat and learned the word boundaries. I said, this looks shorter. The employee said, it's fine. That was her first mistake. Do not tell me something is fine while I am looking directly at the unfine part. Dan leaned in. It looks fine to me. That was his mistake, and it was worse because he has seen that blouse on my actual body. I held it up by the shoulders. The fabric hung there, innocent in a way I did not trust. I said no. It came back shorter. Dan whispered, please don't say emotionally. I looked at him. He looked away. I said, it came back emotionally shorter. If you have ever had an item of clothing returned from somewhere acting different, and everyone wanted you to pretend you were imagining it, subscribe. Apparently, I am now the only person speaking for fabric. The employee said, we cleaned it according to the tag. I said, the tag did not ask you to change its relationship with my waistband. She looked at me for a second. Not rude, just confused in a way that suggested she had not prepared for garment testimony before lunch. I laid the blouse flat. Do you have a measuring tape? Dan said, Karen. I said, this is not a vibes-based garment review. The employee said, we don't usually measure things after cleaning, unless it's alterations. I said, then today we are expanding the service model. She glanced toward the back, which told me she was considering escalation. Good. I support escalation when it brings tools. A man came from the back. Manager energy. Maybe owner. Maybe senior employee. Maybe simply the person allowed to know where the tape measure lives. He said, what's going on? I said, there is a length concern. Dan muttered, there is a blouse situation. I ignored him because marriage is not always a reliable witness when fabric is on trial. The man looked at the blouse and said, looks okay. I laughed once, not loud, just enough to let the room know looks okay had failed. I said, respectfully, looks okay is how sleeves get away with things. The person with the coats shifted slightly. The man with the suit bag became extremely interested in the alteration price list. He was staring at hemming like it owed him money. I said, I need it measured. The employee asked, do you know the original measurement? That was clever. Too clever, I said. I know where it hit on me. Dan whispered, that is not a measurement. I said, it is a lived measurement. The man from the back said, without a before measurement, it's hard to prove shrinkage. I said, then we start with after. Society has to begin somewhere. He pulled out a yellow tape measure. Progress. He laid the blouse flat, not flat enough. I said, can you smooth the left side? He smoothed it. Too hard, I said. Not like you're mad at it. Dan stepped half a foot away from me, as if distance could make him unmarried. The man measured from the shoulder seam to the hem. He said, 23 inches. I said out loud, please. He looked at me. I just said it. Yes, but the blouse deserves a clear record. That was the cold open moment. And yes, I heard someone behind me make a small sound. Could have been a cough, could have been judgment wearing a wool coat. I did not turn around because I was practicing restraint. The man said, louder, 23 inches. I said, thank you. Then I asked, what is standard? He said, it depends on the blouse. There it was. Depends. A word people use when they want the floor to move. I said, this blouse did not used to depend this high. Dan whispered, please stop making height emotional. I said, the hem started it. The employee said, it may look different because it's freshly pressed. Freshly pressed. New suspect, I said. Pressed how? She said, normally. I said, normally? For whom? The man from the back said, pressing can make fabric sit differently. I said, exactly. It is sitting wrong, he said. That doesn't mean it shrank. I said, I didn't say shrank yet. I said shorter. Please don't rush my allegation. Dan stared at the ceiling tiles like he hoped one of them would open. Then I picked up one sleeve. This sleeve used to fall softer. The employee said, the sleeve is the same. I said, you cannot say that without measuring it. The man looked at the tape measure, then at me, then at the blouse, like all three of us had disappointed him in separate categories. He measured the sleeve. I leaned closer. Dan said, do not hover. I am not hovering, I am supervising accuracy. You're almost touching the tape, because the tape looks nervous. The sleeve measured fine, apparently. That does not mean I was wrong. It means the sleeve had prepared better than the hem. Then I remembered the photo. I said, I have evidence, Dan said. No, I said, yes. I pulled out my phone. 3 weeks earlier, I had worn that blouse to Rebecca's backyard brunch. There I was holding lemonade beside a table Dan said was too decorated, which is another unresolved issue. I zoomed in on the blouse. The hem sits lower here, I said. The man leaned in. Dan leaned away. The employee said, it's hard to tell from a photo. Of course it was. People love photos until the photo starts testifying. I said, look at the relationship between the hem and the waistband. The man with the suit bag was no longer reading. I could feel him not reading. The manager person said, it could be hanging differently because it was pressed. I said, so pressing changed the hang. He paused. The pause was important, I said. That is all I needed everyone to hear. Dan whispered. Nobody needed to hear it. The employee said, we can steam it lightly. Now that made sense. Steam is not the same as pressing. Pressing imposes, steam suggests. I said light steam, no aggressive flattening. The blouse was taken to the back. I stayed at the counter because leaving the counter at that point would have implied casualness, and this was not casual. Dan said, we could have gone home. With a blouse that had unresolved vertical issues? It is not a person. Then why does it look defensive? A few minutes later, the employee returned with the blouse. I will be fair. It looked better. Not exonerated. Better. The hem had relaxed. The sleeves looked less offended. The blouse seemed to remember that it used to have manners. The man laid it flat again. I said, measure it? Dan said, no. I said, yes. He measured. 23.5. There it was. Half an inch. Do you know what half an inch is in blouse language? The difference between elegant and boxy. Between nice blouse and did you borrow that from a cousin who stands differently? I said, so it changed. The employee said, the fabric relaxed. I said, after I asked. Dan said, after they steamed it. I said, because I asked. Tell me in the comments, if the blouse gained half an inch after you complained, were you wrong or were you early? The man said, there's no charge. I said, for correcting it? He said, for the steam? I appreciate that, and I did. Then the employee started sliding it back into the plastic sleeve too quickly. I said, wait. Dan's hand moved toward my elbow like he was about to guide a shopping cart with feelings. I just want to see how it hangs. The blouse came out again. A small shift moved through the line behind us. Not a riot, just the sound of people realizing the blouse still had a third act. I held it against myself in the mirror, near the counter. It was better. I could admit that.
But I was not going to stand there and pretend the original concern had been imaginary. People love doing that.
First, they say you're overreacting. Then they fix the thing. Then they want you to apologize for noticing. I said, this is acceptable. The manager person said, great, a little fast. But I let it go because I am generous when progress has occurred. We paid, actually, we had already paid. The receipt was hiding in the garment bag, which raised a separate issue because receipts should not hide under clothing like fugitives. But I chose peace. Outside, Dan stopped beside the car. He said, you made them measure your blouse twice in front of everyone. I said, before and after. That is documentation. You made a dry cleaner emotionally negotiate with fabric, and the fabric improved. He looked at the blouse in the plastic sleeve. Then he looked at me. I'm begging you not to say the blouse learned something. I said nothing, because sometimes love is silence. At home, I hung the blouse in the laundry room and checked it from 3 angles, front, side, slightly judgmental side. It looked good. Not perfect. Good. The hem sat where it should. The sleeves had calmed down. The ivory was still ivory, thank God, because if anyone had turned it white, this would be a different legal category. Later, I posted in the neighborhood chat. Question: if a blouse comes back from the dry cleaner looking shorter, should the cleaner measure it or just say it's fine? Brian replied. Please tell me Dan was not there, Rebecca wrote. Was this the brunch blouse? I wrote. Yes, the one with established hem history. Marcy sent a photo of her dog wearing a tiny dry cleaner vest. At this point, the dog has more uniforms than most municipal employees. Brian wrote, you cannot make people measure vibes. I replied, it was not vibes, it was hem behavior. Rebecca wrote, did they actually measure it? I wrote twice as professionals should. Exactly. The next morning, I almost wrote a review. I did not. I drafted one instead, good steam recovery after initial length concern. Will I post it? Probably not. But documentation matters. Subscribe and turn on notifications, because next time I will explain why I asked the florist if my bouquet was arranged with passive aggression. As for the dry cleaner, I stand by what I did. I did not yell. I did not throw the blouse. I did not accuse anyone of attacking ivory, although the fabric did appear unsettled. I made them measure it, in front of everyone. Because when half an inch appears, disappears, and then returns after steam, someone has to ask what happened. Dan can sigh. The coat customer can tell people I delayed outerwear. The suit bag man can pretend he was reading about alterations. But I know what I saw. A shorter hang, a tense sleeve, a hem with something to hide. If everyone else wants to accept suspicious garment behavior in silence, that is their choice. I chose measurement, my side of the story. Obviously,